There is a man who spent 40 years building the most comprehensive map of the human mind ever attempted. He mapped the archetypes. He charted the unconscious. He gave us the shadow, the anima, the collective memory of the species. He was, by every measure, the most daring psychologist who ever lived. And then he read a short book, 81 poems, written by a man who may not have existed in a language he could barely decipher, and quietly admitted that an anonymous Chinese philosopher had understood the deepest truth about the human mind 25 centuries before he did. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. The book was the Tao Te Ching. And what happened between them is a story about what it costs to know something, and what it feels like when your entire life's work suddenly looks incomplete. I am Andrew, and this is Daily Tao Wisdom, where we go back to the source. Not the quotes on Instagram, not the self-help repackaging. The actual stories, the actual figures, the actual wisdom, and what it means for your life right now. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the most sophisticated theory of the mind ever built in the West still couldn't answer the question Lao Tzu answered in his first paragraph. And what that single gap reveals about how you think, how you suffer, and how you might stop. The year is 1929, Zurich, Switzerland. A study lined floor to ceiling with books, a fireplace, a carved stone tower being built by hand on the shore of Lake Zurich by a man who needs the silence to think. Carl Jung is 54 years old, and he is by any measure winning. He has broken publicly and painfully from his mentor Sigmund Freud, a split so bitter it nearly destroyed him, a rupture that took a decade to recover from. He has survived it. He has built something entirely his own. Analytical psychology. He has mapped the human psyche with a precision no one before him dared attempt. He has named the shadow, the hidden, rejected parts of ourselves we bury in darkness. He has named the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine every person carries. He has named the collective unconscious, the vast, shared reservoir of symbols and stories that all human beings inherit simply by being born. He has argued, against almost all of his contemporaries, that the unconscious is not merely a dumping ground for repressed memories. It is a living, autonomous system with its own intelligence, its own agenda, its own wisdom. This was a radical claim in 1929. It remains a radical claim today, and yet something isn't fitting. Jung's system is brilliant. It is comprehensive. It is deeply useful for his patients. But the deeper he goes into the unconscious, the more he notices a strange pattern. His patients, the ones who are genuinely healing, are not just integrating their shadow. They are not just acknowledging their dark side and making peace with it. They are arriving slowly, painfully, over years of work at a kind of stillness, a kind of unified, effortless presence that seems to operate beyond the reach of ego, beyond effort, beyond intention. He doesn't have a name for it yet. His model doesn't quite account for it. Then a friend, the sinologist Richard Wilhelm, one of the great translators of Chinese thought, sends him a text. It has been translated into German. It is called the Tao Te Ching, and Wilhelm's note says simply, "You should read this." Jung reads it over 3 evenings. On the 4th morning, he sits in his study for a long time without moving. To understand what Jung encountered, you have to understand what he had built and where its edges were. Jung's map of the psyche had a center. He called it the self, capital S, to distinguish it from the everyday ego self. The self in Jung's system is the totality of the psyche. Conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, everything integrated and whole. It is not something you are by default, it is something you become through a long, painful, often terrifying process he called individuation. The goal of individuation is to bring the unconscious into relationship with the conscious mind. To face your shadow, to integrate the parts of yourself you've exiled, to become, in the fullest sense of the word, who you actually are. This is a profound, necessary, genuinely useful map. It has helped millions of people. But here is what Jung began to notice, somewhere in his 50s, somewhere in the long midnight of his self-examination. His map had a direction. Individuation was a journey. It had a beginning, fragmentation, unconsciousness, the unexamined life, and it had an endpoint, the self, integrated and whole. But the Tao Te Ching doesn't have a journey. Or rather, it has a journey, but the journey begins by walking backwards. The first line of the Tao Te Ching says something that every Western philosopher, every Western psychologist instinctively resists. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Don't gloss over that. Sit with it for a moment. Jung had spent his entire career naming things, giving them precise, carefully defined names. The shadow, the anima, the collective unconscious, the individuation process. He believed, as every Western intellectual believes, that to understand something, you must first be able to articulate it, define it, map it. Lao Tzu opens his entire system by saying, the moment you successfully define the deepest truth, you have already left it behind. Jung read that and felt something shift. He wrote in his later notebooks, and I'm paraphrasing here, not quoting, that encountering the Tao Te Ching was like finally seeing the ocean after spending your whole life mapping rivers. The rivers were real. The maps were accurate, but the ocean had a different quality entirely. Here's what makes this collision genuinely strange and genuinely important. Jung and Lao Tzu were not talking about different things. They were talking about the same thing. The deepest reality of the human mind, the ground of consciousness, the source from which everything else emerges. They just approached it from opposite directions. Jung approached it from the ego outward. Start with consciousness, the self you know, the persona you wear in the world, and then excavate. Go down into the layers, face what you find, integrate it, expand. Until finally, after years of this excavation, you arrive at something vast and whole and no longer easily named. Lao Tzu starts there, not as an endpoint, not as the reward for decades of psychological labor. He starts with the Tao, the nameless, undivided, ever-present ground of all being, and then asks, what happens when human beings forget it? What happens when they start dividing, naming, grasping, controlling? The answer, they suffer. Not because something bad happened to them, because they lost contact with what they already were. This is the wound Jung's system couldn't quite locate. His model assumed you had to build your way to wholeness, excavate your way to the self, work your way to integration. And there is truth in this, profound truth. The work of facing your shadow is real and necessary. But Lao Tzu was pointing at something that the excavation model couldn't account for. What if the wholeness was there before the fragmentation? What if the self was not a destination, but a starting point? What if individuation was not about becoming something, but about remembering what you never stopped being? Jung encountered this idea and had what we might charitably call a philosophical crisis. He wrote to a colleague around this period, "The further I penetrate the unconscious, the more I am convinced that it does not operate as I thought." He had been working with a spatial metaphor: consciousness on the surface, unconscious depth below, self at the bottom. Go deep enough and you find the treasure. The Tao doesn't work that way. The Tao is not at the bottom. The Tao is not anywhere in particular. It is the medium through which everything moves, including your search for it. You do not find the Tao by going deeper. You find it, if find is even the right word, by stopping, by ceasing the search, by becoming, in Lao Tzu's phrase, like water, which does not go anywhere, which simply flows to wherever it already belongs. You've probably tried the Jungian approach without knowing it, the relentless self-examination, the journaling, the therapy, the analysis of your patterns, the honest reckoning with your shadows. There is nothing wrong with any of this, but you may have noticed that the more precisely you map yourself, the further away the map starts to feel from whatever it is you were actually trying to find. That gap between the map and the territory is exactly what Jung felt sitting in his Zurich study, reading Lao Tzu for the first time. But here's where the story gets stranger. Jung didn't just admire the Tao Te Ching. He went looking for it in his patients. Starting in the early 1930s, Jung began noticing something in the patients who reached the deepest stages of analysis, the ones who had done years of work, who had integrated significant shadow material, who had moved far along the individuation process. Something was happening to them that his model predicted but couldn't quite explain. They were becoming effortless. Not lazy, not passive, not defeated. Effortless. They stopped fighting themselves. They stopped forcing things. They stopped trying to become something and simply started being whatever they were. And paradoxically, this is when they became most effective, most alive, most fully themselves. Jung watched this happen, case after case, and began to suspect it wasn't something his system had produced. His system had created the conditions for it. But whatever was happening had a different origin. He went back to the Tao Te Ching. He went to the concept he found most confusing, most resistant to his Western categories, Wu Wei. Wu Wei is usually translated as non-action or effortless action, which sounds passive, which sounds to the Western ear like giving up. It isn't. And the reason Jung found it so compelling is because it described, more precisely than his own vocabulary could, what he was watching in his most healed patients. Wu Wei is not the absence of action. It is the absence of forcing. The action is real. The movement is real. The work is real. But there is no longer a gap between the actor and the action, no longer a self standing behind the movement, watching it, judging it, trying to control its outcome. Lao Tzu used 3 images to describe this: water, an uncarved block, an empty vessel. Water does not decide to carve the canyon. It does not force anything. It simply moves toward wherever is lower, following the path of least resistance. And over time, it cuts through stone. The uncarved block, Pew, is the original human being before society. Ambition, fear, and the need for approval have carved it into a shape. The Taoists were not romanticizing primitiveness. They were pointing at a specific quality of unforced integral wholeness that exists before the carving begins, and that can, with discipline, be recovered. The empty vessel is the most radical image. The usefulness of a bowl is its emptiness. A bowl full of something else cannot receive. The mind that is already full of its own analysis, its own categories, its own careful maps. Such a mind cannot receive what the unconscious is actually offering. Jung wrote about this in the 1930s with something close to embarrassment. He had spent 40 years filling the vessel with increasingly precise contents. And here was an ancient Chinese text suggesting that the capacity to receive, the emptiness, was the point, not the contents. Sound familiar? Think about the last time you were in the middle of something, a conversation, a problem, a moment of genuine creativity, and it was working. Not because you were forcing it, because you weren't. The thinking was happening, but you weren't doing it. The words were coming, but you weren't choosing them. There was a kind of fluid intelligence operating that seemed larger than your deliberate, effortful self. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't luck. That was the state Lao Tzu spent 81 poems trying to point at. Here is what most people miss about this story. Jung didn't just read the Tao Te Ching. He wrote about it, extensively. And the writing reveals something quietly devastating about where Western psychology had arrived by the mid-20th century. In 1929, the same year he first encountered the text deeply, Jung wrote the foreword to Richard Wilhelm's German translation of another Taoist text, The Secret of the Golden Flower. This was a Chinese Taoist practice manual on inner alchemy, the transformation of consciousness through meditation, visualization, and the cultivation of a centered, unified awareness. The foreword Jung wrote for that book is one of the most unusual documents in the history of Western psychology. It is a Swiss psychiatrist, one of the most rigorous, systematically minded intellectuals of the 20th century, essentially saying, the East got there first. He writes that reading The Secret of the Golden Flower confirmed for him that the deepest therapeutic goal, the thing he had been working toward with his patients without quite knowing how to articulate it, was not the integration of individual shadow material. It was what he called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold opposites in tension without collapsing, to move beyond the ego's demand for resolution, and to arrive at something he could only describe as a living symbol of wholeness. He then notes carefully that the Taoist text described this process with a precision and simplicity that his own vocabulary simply couldn't match. This is not a small admission. This is the equivalent of Einstein writing the foreword to a physics textbook and saying, the author understood relativity 2,000 years ago, and I still haven't improved on the description. What was it exactly that the Taoist text described so precisely? The circulation of the light. This is the central practice of the secret of the golden flower, a meditative technique where awareness is turned inward and circulated, neither grasping nor rejecting, neither forcing nor escaping. Not excavating, not analyzing, circulating. Jung recognized immediately that this was what his healed patients were doing spontaneously, not because he had taught them, but because the psyche, left to its own intelligent process, naturally moves toward this state when the obstacles are removed. He had been removing obstacles. He had been mapping the obstacles with extraordinary precision, but he had assumed that once the obstacles were cleared, the patient would then arrive somewhere. The Taoists were saying, There is nowhere to arrive. The circulation is the point. The movement itself, the unforced, continuous, self-sustaining awareness of the unified psyche, that is health. That is what the Taoists called Te. Not virtue in the moral sense, virtue in the old sense of the word. The inherent power, the natural excellence, the force that emerges when something is fully what it is. Now, here is the detail most people skip, but it's the one that makes this story human. Jung built his tower by hand. Starting in 1923 and continuing for decades, Jung constructed a stone tower on the shore of Lake Zurich at a place called Bollingen. No electricity initially, no telephone. He cut stone himself, laid mortar himself, carried wood himself. He spent weeks there alone in silence, doing manual work. He never fully explained why. But in his memoir, written near the end of his life, he said that the tower was the most real thing he had ever made. More real in some ways than his books. More real than his theories. He was a man who had spent 40 years living almost entirely in the mind. In concepts, in interpretations, in the skilled analysis of other people's interior lives. And he built a stone tower with his hands because some part of him, some intelligent, pre-theoretical part of him, knew that the mind was not enough, that the Tao could not be reached by more thinking. This is, if you know the Tao Te Ching, a deeply Taoist gesture. Chapter 16. Return to the root. This is called stillness. Chapter 48. In pursuit of learning, every day something is acquired. In pursuit of Tao, every day something is dropped. Jung was dropping things. Slowly, reluctantly, with the resistance of a man whose entire identity was built on the acquisition of understanding. He was learning, in the second half of his life, that the most honest thing he could say about the deepest reality he had spent his life investigating was not a theory. It was a stone tower at the edge of a lake. It was silence. It was the willingness to not know. He carved an inscription above the entrance to his home in Kusnacht, a Latin phrase that translates roughly as, "Summoned or not, the god will come." The tower itself he left mostly wordless, as if, after everything, he understood that some things resist inscription. He could not bring himself to write the Tao Te Ching's actual answer, but he was standing at its edge. Let me be precise about what happened here, because it is easy to misread this story. Jung's system was not wrong. His map of the shadow is one of the most practically useful psychological frameworks ever produced. His concept of the collective unconscious has been confirmed, in different language, by modern neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and cultural anthropology. His work with patients saved lives. It continues to save lives. What the Tao Te Ching broke was not his theory. It broke his assumption about the direction of the theory. He had assumed that the movement of psychological growth was from fragmentation toward wholeness, from the divided, unconscious, shadow-driven ego toward the integrated self. The Tao Te Ching said, "The wholeness is not at the end of the journey. The wholeness is what you started from. The fragmentation, the ego, the persona, the social mask, the defended self, is what was added later. The self is not built. It is uncovered, and the uncovering is not accomplished by more effort. It is accomplished by less." This did not mean Jung's method was wrong. It meant the metaphor was inverted. Think of it this way. If you have a muddy pond, you can try to clean it by going in and removing mud, piece by piece, with increasing precision and effort. This is useful. You will eventually get most of the mud out, or you can let it settle. Not because the work of removing mud isn't sometimes necessary, sometimes it absolutely is. But beneath all the stirred-up sediment, the water was always clear. The clarity is not something you create, it is something you allow. Jung spent the last decades of his life allowing. His later work on synchronicity, on alchemy, on the psychology of religion moves toward this. It becomes less systematic, less taxonomic, more comfortable with mystery, more willing to gesture at things that cannot quite be named, more, in short, like the Tao Te Ching. He never became a Taoist. He remained in his bones a European, a scientist, a man who could not resist the impulse to understand. But he became slowly a man who understood the limits of understanding, who knew from the inside what Lao Tzu meant when he wrote, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking this is a beautiful story about two extraordinary minds across 25 centuries. But I have a performance review on Thursday and a relationship that isn't working, and 3 unread emails from my manager that I'm avoiding. So let me be concrete. The Jungian trap, which is also the modern trap, is the belief that if you understand yourself well enough, you will finally be okay. If you can identify the pattern, name the wound, trace the origin, map the dynamic, then you will be free of it. This is a seductive belief. It has produced a lot of genuinely helpful therapy and a lot of genuinely useless rumination. And the difference between the two is exactly what separates Jung's method from the Tao Te Ching's answer. The helpful version of self-examination is the one where the examination eventually ends, where you reach a point, not of perfect self-knowledge, but of sufficient self-acceptance, where you stop needing the map because you're no longer lost, where the analysis gives way to presence, where the understanding relaxes into living. The useless version is the one that never ends, where every relationship becomes a psychological case study, where every emotion becomes a symptom to be diagnosed, where the habit of self-analysis is so deeply grooved that even in moments of genuine peace, some part of you is standing outside the peace, observing it, questioning its authenticity. That voice, the one that observes your own experience from a slight remove, that is what the Taoists call the calculating mind. The mind that cannot stop dividing, categorizing, naming. The mind that mistakes its own activity for reality. Here is what the Tao Te Ching is actually suggesting practically, concretely, for your Thursday. At some point today, something will happen that you don't like. A message that irritates you. A task that feels pointless, a moment of boredom or frustration. Your instinct, the instinct of every educated, psychologically sophisticated person, will be to understand it, to ask, where does this feeling come from? What does it mean? What does my reaction reveal about my unresolved patterns? That is sometimes the right move, but sometimes and learn to feel the difference. The right move is to let it settle, not repress it, not push it away, not perform equanimity you don't feel. Let it settle, like a muddy pond, without adding more motion. You do not always need to know why you feel what you feel. The feeling will complete itself if you let it and pass. The water will clear. The Tao does not require your analysis. There is a specific practice Jung discovered, not in his analytical work, but at Bollingen, building his tower, that the Tao Te Ching had already described. He called it active imagination. But in its deepest form, it is simply this: Doing one thing with your full attention, without the commentary. Cutting stone, pouring tea, walking by the lake. Not thinking about cutting stone or pouring tea or walking, just the act, complete in itself, requiring nothing further. This is not a meditation technique. It is not a productivity hack. It is a way of briefly restoring contact with the ground you never actually left. Try it today. Not for 20 minutes, for 2 minutes. One task, no commentary. That is what Carl Jung learned from a man who died in the 4th century BCE. And it is the only thing in his entire life's work that he admitted he could not improve on. If this is the kind of depth you've been looking for forgotten stories, the actual ideas, the actual history, subscribe. We go here every week and drop a comment. Where in your own life do you feel the tension between understanding more and needing something you can't analyze? I'm genuinely curious, because the people who answer that question honestly are usually the ones standing right where Jung was standing in 1929. Return with me for a moment to that Zurich study. 1929, the stone tower being built on the lake. A man who has spent his entire adult life learning to name things, sitting quietly with a book that opens by saying, "The name is not the thing." What did Jung do with what he found? He did not abandon his work. He did not become a hermit or renounce the world of the mind. He kept practicing. He kept writing. He kept seeing patients. He kept trying to understand. But something changed. In his later work, there is a quality of permission. Permission for mystery. Permission for not knowing. Permission for the experience that cannot quite be captured in a theory, that settles in the body before it reaches the intellect, that is gone by the time you found the words. He wrote near the end of his life in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a sentence that I think is the most honest thing any Western psychologist ever wrote. I have no theory about dreams. I do not know how dreams arise, and I am not sure that my way of handling dreams even deserves the name of a method. The man who had named more things than anyone in the history of psychology. Sitting with not knowing. That is what 25 centuries of Taoist practice produces. That is what Lao Tzu was pointing at in the first line. Not a destination, not a method, not a theory. The capacity to encounter reality directly, without the glass of the map between you and it. The question Jung left open was not, what is the Tao? He understood eventually that the question was unanswerable. The question he left open, the one he was still sitting with when he died in 1961, at 85 years old, was quieter than that. What remains when you stop trying to understand it? Spend one evening this week finding out. The next video goes somewhere Jung never dared to the Taoist figures who lived what he only theorized. The ones who actually stopped. The ones who left no theory at all. Stay curious. Stay still. This is daily Tao wisdom. The rest is yours.